His name was a thunderclap on the fields of Troy, a name synonymous with invincible. Achilles, son of a goddess, was the perfect warrior, a demigod of breathtaking speed and strength. Legends claimed he was impervious to any weapon, a living embodiment of martial perfection destined for eternal glory. But beneath the divine armor beat a fiercely human heart, capable of profound love, burning pride, and a rage that could challenge the gods themselves. His story is not just one of conquest, but of a man wrestling with a fate he could not escape. It is the chronicle of a hero whose invincibility was legendary, yet whose true story is defined by a single, inescapable vulnerability. This is the saga of the greatest warrior who ever lived, and how his ultimate weakness was not a flaw in his flesh, but the very essence of his humanity. In an age when the line between the divine and the mortal was a shimmering veil, the gods of Olympus often walked among humans, their passions and politics shaping the destinies of kings and kingdoms. Among the immortals, none were more desired than Thetis, a nymph of the sea, whose beauty was so profound it captured the attention of Zeus himself, the king of the gods. But with this divine attention came a dangerous prophecy, one that echoed with the threat of cosmic upheaval. It was foretold that any son born to Thetis would be far greater than his father. For Zeus, who had seized power by overthrowing his own father, the Titan Cronus, these words were not a promise of a great legacy, but a direct threat to his eternal reign. The king of the gods could not risk siring a son who would one day challenge him for the throne of Olympus. To neutralize the threat, Zeus orchestrated a different fate for Thetis. She would be married not to a god, but to a mortal, the noble king Peleus of Phthia. Their wedding was the grandest affair the world had ever seen, held on the slopes of Mount Pelion. Nearly all the gods were in attendance, bringing lavish gifts and blessings for the union of immortal and mortal. Yet, the celebration was famously marred by the one goddess left uninvited, Eris, the spirit of discord. Her vengeful act of tossing a golden apple inscribed "for the fairest" among the goddesses would plant the seeds of a future conflict, a war that would ultimately consume the next generation. But on that day, the immediate consequence of the union was the birth of a child, a boy named Achilles. He was a demigod, inheriting the divine grace of his mother and the mortality of his father. This dual nature placed him in a unique and perilous position. Soon after his birth, a second, more personal prophecy emerged, defining the two paths his life could take. He could choose a long, peaceful, and unremarkable existence, dying of old age, surrounded by family but forgotten by the world. Or he could choose a short life, one filled with the clash of bronze and the roar of battle, that would end in an early demise, but grant him a prize the Greeks valued above all else: eternal glory. Hearing this, Thetis was filled with a mother's unique terror. She had been used as a pawn by the gods to protect their own power, and now her son's life was to be a choice between oblivion and a premature end. This she could not accept. Her divine heart, now bound by mortal love for her child, began a desperate search for a way to defy fate itself, to shield her son from the destiny the gods had written for him. Her quest would lead her to the very edge of the mortal world, to a place of immense power and even greater risk. Thetis, driven by the terrifying prophecy of her son's short and glorious life, refused to accept his fate. A mother's love became a force of nature, a will powerful enough to challenge destiny. She sought to grant Achilles what the gods had denied him, a life free from the vulnerabilities of mortals. Her search for a solution led her away from the sunlit world of Olympus and down to the shadowy frontiers of existence, to the one place in creation where the laws of life and mortality were said to be mutable, the underworld. Her destination was the river Styx, a name spoken in hushed tones even by the gods. The Styx was no ordinary river. Its dark, swirling waters formed the sacred boundary between the land of the living and the realm of the departed. According to legend, its currents held extraordinary power. An oath sworn upon the Styx was unbreakable, even for Zeus. And, it was believed, its waters could bestow the gift of invulnerability upon any mortal bathed within them. In a desperate act of defiance, Thetis carried her infant son to a cavernous, echoing chamber through which the great river flowed. Holding him fast, she submerged the child in the cold, potent waters. The river's magic took hold, flowing over his skin and making it impervious to any blade or spear. She was creating not just a man, but a living weapon, a perfect warrior who could never be harmed in battle. But in her focused determination, in the tight grip she used to hold her precious child against the river's current, she made a single, fateful oversight. The part of his body by which she held him, his heel, remained dry, untouched by the magical water. This tiny patch of skin was left as vulnerable as that of any other mortal. It was an imperceptible flaw, a secret known only to her. This act, born of a mother's fierce desire to protect, ironically became the source of his one great weakness. She had shielded him from almost everything, but in doing so, she had created the very anchor to his fated mortality. Achilles was now a paradox, a man who was nearly a god, whose body was a fortress, save for one small, unguarded gate. Thetis may have believed she had outwitted the prophecy, but all she had truly done was refine its terms. Fate did not need 1,000 weaknesses to claim a hero. It only needed one. Years passed, and Achilles grew into a young man of extraordinary prowess. Under the tutelage of the wise centaur Chiron, he mastered the arts of war, music, and medicine, becoming faster, stronger, and more skilled than any of his contemporaries. His divine heritage was undeniable. Yet, the prophecy of his demise at Troy remained a constant shadow in his mother's mind. As whispers of a coming war in the east grew louder, Thetis knew that the Achaean kings would soon come looking for the warrior destined to be their champion. To hide him from the world, she devised a radical plan, one that would conceal his warrior nature under the most unlikely of cloaks. She took her son to the remote island of Skyros, ruled by King Lycomedes. There, Achilles, the fiercest young man in Greece, was presented to the court not as a prince, but as a princess. He was disguised as a maiden, given the name Pyrrha, meaning the fiery-haired one, and was hidden amongst the king's own daughters. For months, Achilles lived this secret life. The hands that were born to wield a spear learned to spin thread. The voice that would one day command armies learned to sing gentle songs. It was a life of profound internal conflict, his true identity suppressed by his mother's loving command. During this time, he formed a close bond with one of the true princesses, Deidamia, a relationship that deepened into a secret romance and resulted in the birth of a son, Neoptolemus. Meanwhile, the Greek forces were gathering. The great seer, Calchas, had declared that their expedition against Troy was doomed to fail unless Achilles fought among them. The task of finding the hidden demigod fell to the most cunning of the Greek kings, Odysseus of Ithaca. Odysseus, a master of deception himself, suspected Thetis's ruse. He sailed to Skyros, disguised as a traveling merchant, his ship laden with treasures. He laid out his wares before the princesses of the court, gleaming jewelry, fine silks, and intricate perfumes. But among the feminine treasures, he strategically placed a magnificent set of weapons, a bronze-tipped spear, a shield polished to a mirror shine, and a finely crafted sword. The trap was set, waiting for the right moment to be sprung. The moment Odysseus had engineered arrived with the sudden, piercing blast of a battle horn from outside the palace walls. It was a signal of attack, a sound Achilles had been trained since birth to recognize. While the princesses scattered in confusion, instinct took over. The years of disguise melted away in an instant. Achilles, the warrior Pyrrha, ignored the jewels and silks, striding directly to the weapons. He seized the shield and spear, his posture shifting from that of a maiden to that of a soldier ready for combat. The ruse was over. Odysseus stepped forward, his merchant's disguise falling away to reveal the king of Ithaca. He had found his champion. At that moment, Thetis appeared, perhaps through her divine power, her face a mask of sorrow. Her desperate plan had failed. With all pretense gone, she presented her son with the prophecy one final time, not as a distant fate, but as an immediate and unavoidable choice. It was a decision that would define his entire existence. Odysseus spoke of honor, of the great Achaean alliance, and of the need to sail for Troy to reclaim the Spartan queen, Helen. He spoke of Kleos, the Greek ideal of immortal glory won through great deeds. He offered Achilles a chance to have his name echo through eternity. Thetis offered him the alternative, a life. She pleaded with him to stay, to choose the path of peace. He could marry, watch his son grow, and live to be a contented old man, ruling his father's kingdom. He would have a full life, but when he was gone, his name would fade like any other, lost to the sands of time. The choice was stark, a long life of obscurity or a short life of eternal fame. For Achilles, it was a profound internal struggle. He had experienced a taste of a peaceful life on Skyros, knowing the love of a woman and the joy of fatherhood. The appeal of a quiet future was real. Yet, the call to battle, the promise of glory, and the very nature of his divine blood pulled him irresistibly toward the horizon of war. He was not born to be a farmer or a quiet king. He was born to be the greatest warrior the world would ever know. In a moment of tragic and noble clarity, he made his choice. He looked at his mother, his expression one of both love and resolve, and chose glory. He chose the path that he knew led to an early end. He would not be a victim of fate, but its willing agent. He accepted his destiny, and in doing so, sealed it. The hero had answered the call. The news of Achilles' decision spread like a shockwave through the Hellenic world. The greatest warrior of the age had joined the cause. His commitment was the final piece of the puzzle, a catalyst that transformed a coalition of bickering kings into a unified and formidable war machine. From every corner of Greece, the response was immense. Ships were launched from the shores of Mycenae, Sparta, Pylos, and Ithaca, all converging on the vast, wind-swept bay of Aulis. It was an assembly of military might unlike any seen before. Here, the legendary heroes of the age gathered. There was Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae and commander-in-chief of the Achaean army, his pride as vast as his ambition. Beside him stood his brother, Menelaus, the king of Sparta, whose personal grievance was the justification for this entire war. The cunning Odysseus was there, his mind already working on strategies for the siege ahead. The wise, elderly Nestor offered counsel from a lifetime of experience, while the giant warrior Ajax stood as a mountain of pure strength. Into this gathering of titans, Achilles made his own dramatic entrance. He arrived not as a mere soldier, but as a king in his own right, leading his own contingent of 50 ships. His men were the Myrmidons, an elite fighting force from Phthia, trained to perfection and fiercely loyal to him alone. At his side was the person who knew him best, not just as a warrior, but as a man, his beloved companion and comrade in arms, Patroclus. Their bond was legendary, a friendship that would prove to be as pivotal to the war as Achilles' own strength. The fleet was a breathtaking spectacle. Nearly 1,200 black-hulled ships crowded the harbor, their masts like a great forest. But as the day of departure dawned, a stillness fell over Aulis. The winds died completely. The sails hung limp and useless. The great armada was stranded. The seer Calchas was consulted, and he delivered a chilling verdict. The goddess Artemis was enraged with Agamemnon for an act of sacrilege. To appease her divine wrath and release the winds, she demanded a terrible price be paid by the expedition's leader. A shadow fell over the Greek camp as the full cost of their venture began to reveal itself. The internal tensions, especially the simmering rivalry between the proud Achilles and the arrogant Agamemnon, began to surface. After the dreadful sacrifice was made, the winds returned. A fresh breeze blew from the land, filling the sails and the hearts of the men with a renewed sense of purpose. The order was given. Anchors were raised, and the 1,000 ships began to move as one, a vast constellation of bronze and timber sailing east across the Aegean. Their destination was the distant shore of Troy, and their purpose was a war that would be remembered for all time. The call to war echoed across the Aegean, a summons that reached even the most hidden corners of Greece. For Achilles, it was not a surprise, but a destiny foretold. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, knew the prophecy. If her son went to Troy, he would gain eternal glory, but live a short life. If he stayed, he would have a long, peaceful existence, but be forgotten by history. In a desperate attempt to cheat fate, she hid him on the island of Skyros, disguised as a maiden among the daughters of King Lycomedes. There, among the tapestries and lyres, the greatest warrior of his generation lived a quiet life, even fathering a son, Neoptolemus, with the princess Deidamia. But destiny cannot be so easily evaded. The Achaean leaders, knowing they could not win without Achilles, sent their most cunning mind, Odysseus, to find him. Arriving as a merchant, Odysseus laid out his wares before the princesses: fine silks, intricate jewelry, and among them a magnificent sword and shield. As his companions sounded a battle horn, a signal of a supposed attack, the young women scattered in alarm. All but one. Achilles, his warrior instincts overpowering his disguise, instinctively seized the weapons, ready for a fight. His identity was revealed. The choice was now his to make. Standing before Odysseus, Achilles shed the last vestiges of his sheltered life. He chose glory. He chose Troy. Returning to his homeland of Phthia, he did not go alone. He summoned his personal army, the legendary Myrmidons. They were a force unlike any other, said to be descended from ants transformed into men, embodying the ants' tireless work ethic and fierce loyalty. Under Achilles' command, they were honed into the most disciplined and formidable fighting unit in the Achaean host. They were more than soldiers. They were an extension of his will, moving as one body with lethal precision. As he prepared to depart, Thetis presented him with a final gift, a suit of divine armor forged by the smith god Hephaestus himself. The shield was a masterpiece, depicting the heavens and the earth, scenes of peace and conflict, a microcosm of the world he was fighting for and leaving behind. Clad in celestial bronze, Achilles stood before his Myrmidon warriors, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The journey to Troy was about to begin, a path to immortality from which he knew there was no return. The Achaean fleet was a terrifying spectacle, a floating city of black-hulled ships cutting through the wine-dark sea. On board, thousands of warriors, the greatest heroes of their age, felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. A somber prophecy had spread through the ships, a divine warning that dampened even the most ardent spirits. The first Achaean to set foot on Trojan soil would be the first to fall in the war. As the fleet approached the shores of Troy, a tense silence fell over the armada. The Trojan defenders, led by their champion Hector, lined the beaches, ready to repel the invaders. For a long moment, no one moved. The heroes hesitated, each man weighing his ambition against the certainty of the prophecy. Then, one man's courage broke the spell. Peleus, a prince from Thessaly, leaped from his ship and charged onto the sand. He fought with incredible bravery, but his fate was sealed. He was struck down by Hector, becoming the first sacrifice of the war, his name forever etched in the annals of heroism. His act of valor, however, broke the Achaean paralysis. Inspired, the army surged forward. But it was Achilles who turned the tide into a storm. He did not simply land. He erupted onto the beach like a force of nature. With his myrmidons at his back, he carved a path through the Trojan ranks, his divine armor deflecting spears, his presence sowing panic among the defenders. His first major challenge was Cycnus, a son of the sea god Poseidon, who was reputed to be invulnerable to blades. Achilles' spear and sword glanced harmlessly off the warrior's skin. The duel became a brutal contest of strength and will. Realizing conventional weapons were useless, Achilles used his immense power to physically overwhelm his opponent, forcing him to the ground and demonstrating a resourcefulness as deadly as his spear. The fall of the seemingly invincible Cycnus sent a shockwave of fear through the Trojans. They broke ranks and retreated behind the safety of their colossal walls. The Achaeans had secured their beachhead, but the cost was already apparent. As they fortified their camp, the great city of Troy stood before them, silent and defiant. Achilles had made his devastating arrival known, but the true test, the impenetrable fortress itself, loomed over them, promising a long and arduous conflict ahead. The initial fiery momentum of the invasion soon cooled into the harsh reality of a protracted siege. The legendary walls of Troy proved to be as formidable as the myths claimed. The war devolved from a single, decisive campaign into a grinding 10-year test of endurance. For 9 of those years, the conflict was a stalemate, a war of attrition fought not just at the gates of Troy, but across the entire region. Achilles, though the Achaeans' greatest weapon, could not breach the walls alone. Instead, he became their chief provider and enforcer. He led the Myrmidons on a series of relentless raids against Troy's allied cities and islands, disrupting supply lines and amassing resources for the Achaean army. One by one, nearly 24 towns fell to his strategic brilliance and overwhelming force. In the sack of Lyrnessus, he captured a young woman named Briseis. From another raid came Chryseis. These captures, seemingly minor spoils of war at the time, would later become the pivot upon which the fate of the entire Achaean army would turn. While Achilles was away on these campaigns, his legend grew. To the Trojans, he was a specter of destruction, his name whispered with fear. To the Achaeans, he was the guarantor of their eventual victory, yet his very effectiveness kept him on the periphery of the main camp's simmering politics. Meanwhile, inside the city, Hector, son of King Priam, emerged as the steadfast defender of his people. He was Troy's answer to Achilles, noble, courageous, and devoted to his family and city. While Achilles projected Achaean power outward, Hector consolidated Trojan defense inward, holding the line and repelling any direct assault on the walls. For 9 years, these two titans, the conflict's central figures, circled each other without ever meeting in a decisive duel. The long stalemate took its toll. The Achaean camp transformed from a temporary military outpost into a sprawling, semi-permanent settlement plagued by weariness and discontent. The initial quest for glory had faded, replaced by the mundane routine of survival and a deep longing for home. After 9 years of skirmishes and raids, the ultimate prize remained untouched. The Achaean leaders grew restless, their alliances strained by jealousy and fatigue. It was in this tense atmosphere that the seeds of internal conflict began to sprout, threatening to accomplish what the Trojan army could not. The 10th year of the war began not with a climactic battle, but with a silent, invisible enemy. A devastating plague swept through the Achaean camp, sent by the god Apollo. The funeral pyres burned day and night, and the morale of the army collapsed. Desperate for answers, the Achaeans gathered in a tense assembly. The seer, Calchas, revealed the divine cause. Agamemnon, commander of the Achaean forces, had offended Apollo. He had taken Chryseis, the daughter of the god's priest, as his war prize, and had arrogantly dismissed her father's pleas for her return. It was Achilles, ever protective of the army's welfare, who publicly urged Calchas to speak, offering his personal protection against the king's wrath. This act placed him on a collision course with Agamemnon. Under the immense pressure of his dying army, Agamemnon reluctantly agreed to return Chryseis to her father. But his pride, as vast and fragile as his authority, was deeply wounded. In front of the entire assembly, he declared that if he was to be deprived of his prize, he would compensate himself by taking one from another commander. His eyes fell on Achilles. He demanded Briseis, Achilles' own cherished prize, a symbol of his honor and military triumphs. The demand was a calculated humiliation, a public assertion of Agamemnon's dominance over his most valuable but most independent warrior. For Achilles, this was an unforgivable insult. It negated 9 years of sacrifice, risk, and unwavering service. It was a statement that his honor was meaningless before the king's whim. Blinding rage consumed him. His hand went to the hilt of his sword, and for a heart-stopping moment, the Achaean alliance was on the verge of self-destruction. As he began to draw his blade, a divine presence intervened. The goddess Athena, visible only to him, appeared and caught him by his golden hair. She commanded him to check his fury, to fight with words, not weapons, promising that his honor would be repaid many times over if he showed restraint. Achilles obeyed. He forced his sword back into its sheath, but his rage was merely redirected. He unleashed a furious torrent of insults at Agamemnon, calling him a greedy coward who hid behind the front lines while better men fought and risked their lives. Then, casting his ceremonial staff to the ground, he made a terrible oath. He swore that he and his Myrmidons would fight no more. He would withdraw to his ships and watch as Agamemnon and his army paid the price for this dishonor. The Achaean war effort was suddenly fractured, its greatest champion silenced not by a Trojan spear, but by the pride of his own king. The Achaean camp was a hollowed-out version of itself. The absence of Achilles and his Myrmidons created a vacuum of power and confidence that the Trojans could feel from across the plains. From the stern of his ship, Achilles watched, his heart hardened by a sense of profound injustice. His rage was not a fleeting passion, it was a cold, calculated state of being. He summoned his goddess mother, Thetis, from the depths of the sea and made a devastating request. He asked her to appeal to Zeus, the king of the gods, and have him grant victory to the Trojans. He wanted the Achaeans to suffer. He wanted them to be driven back against their own ships, to feel the terror of imminent defeat. Only then, he reasoned, would they truly understand his worth and the magnitude of Agamemnon's insult. Zeus, who owed Thetis a favor, consented. The tide of the war turned with divine speed. The Trojans, now blessed by the gods and led by the magnificent Hector, stormed from their city with newfound courage. They crashed against the Achaean lines like a tidal wave. The Achaean heroes, one by one, fell or were wounded. Diomedes, Odysseus, even Agamemnon himself were forced to retreat from the field. The Trojan army broke through the Achaean fortifications, their war cries echoing across the camp as they pushed relentlessly toward the beached ships, torches in hand, ready to burn the entire fleet. Panic seized the Achaean leaders. Agamemnon, finally grasping the catastrophe his pride had unleashed, admitted his folly. He organized an embassy to Achilles, a desperate last attempt at reconciliation. He chose Odysseus, the master orator, Ajax, a giant of a warrior respected by all, and Phoenix, Achilles' beloved childhood tutor. They went to Achilles' tent bearing an extraordinary offer, the return of Briseis, untouched, along with a treasure of bronze and gold, dominion over 7 cities, and the hand of one of Agamemnon's own daughters in marriage. Achilles listened to their pleas in stony silence. Then he spoke. His rejection was absolute and filled with a deep, philosophical bitterness. He scorned the material gifts, declaring that no price could restore his stolen honor. He spoke of the 2 fates offered to him, a long, anonymous life, or a short, glorious one. Agamemnon's actions, he argued, had rendered that glory meaningless. Why should he fight and risk his singular life for a king who treated him with such contempt? He announced his stunning intention. At dawn, he would set sail for home, leaving the Achaeans to their fate. The embassy returned, defeated. The Achaean cause seemed utterly lost. As the night deepened, the orange glow of Trojan torches flickered ever closer to the ships. Achilles' rage had brought his allies to the very edge of annihilation, and he seemed content to let them fall. The tide of war had turned against the Achaeans. Without Achilles, their heart and their spearhead, the Greek army was a body without a soul. On the plains before Troy, the heroic defense led by champions like Diomedes and Ajax began to crumble. The great wall they had built to protect their ships, a testament to their engineering and a symbol of their permanence, now seemed fragile. Hector, Prince of Troy, fought with a divine fury, sensing that victory was within his grasp. The Trojans, once cowering behind their impenetrable walls, now surged forward, pushing the invaders back toward the sea, their last refuge. This was not merely a shift in military fortune, it was a cosmic rebalancing. In the heavens, the gods watched, their allegiances tangled in a web of pride, jealousy, and ancient pacts. Zeus, king of the gods, had given his word to the sea nymph Thetis. He would honor her request to let the Achaeans suffer until they restored her son's honor. He sat on Mount Ida, observing the conflict, his will an unshakable force guiding the Trojan advance. Hera and Athena, the steadfast patrons of the Greeks, could only watch in frustration, bound by the superior power of Zeus. Their impotence was a bitter pill, a reminder that even deities were subject to a higher authority. On the ground, the consequences were devastating. The Achaean leaders, gathered in Agamemnon's tent, were desperate. The wise old Nestor, who had seen generations of warriors, could offer no strategy to counter the Trojan onslaught. Agamemnon, the great king, the commander of 1,000 ships, was a picture of regret. The arrogance that had led him to insult Achilles had evaporated, replaced by the cold fear of annihilation. He saw his men faltering, his ships threatened by Trojan torches, and his entire expedition on the verge of catastrophic failure. The prize of Troy seemed a distant dream. Now, survival was the only goal. He had defied the greatest warrior of his age, and in doing so, he had invited ruin. The absence of one man had broken the most powerful army in the world. As the sounds of battle grew closer and the smell of smoke drifted into the camp, Agamemnon finally understood the depth of his folly. Pride had brought them to the brink. Now, only humility could offer a sliver of hope. With defeat looming, Agamemnon swallowed his pride and made a desperate gamble. He would send an embassy to Achilles, begging him to return. But this could be no ordinary mission. He chose 3 of the most respected Achaean leaders, each calculated to appeal to a different aspect of Achilles' nature. First was Odysseus, the master of strategy and persuasion, whose silver tongue could sway kings. Second was the giant Ajax, a warrior of immense power and simple honesty, a man who fought with his hands, not his words. Finally, there was Phoenix, the old horseman who had been Achilles' tutor and foster father, a man who could appeal to the bonds of love and memory. They carried with them the promise of a king's ransom. Agamemnon offered a treasure trove of gold, bronze tripods, and fine horses. He offered the return of the woman Briseis, with a solemn oath that he had never touched her. He even offered one of his own daughters in marriage, with a rich dowry. It was an apology of epic proportions, a complete capitulation. The three heroes found Achilles not brooding in anger, but sitting peacefully outside his tent, playing a lyre and singing of the glories of heroes from ages past. He greeted his comrades with surprising warmth and hospitality, offering them food and wine. For a moment, it seemed as if their mission might succeed. Odysseus spoke first, laying out Agamemnon's offer with flawless logic. He spoke of the suffering of the Achaeans, the danger to the ships, and the eternal glory Achilles would win by saving them. But Achilles was unmoved. His reply was a torrent of bitterness and disillusionment. He rejected the gifts, calling them trinkets meant to buy his honor. He spoke of his two fates, revealed to him by his mother, a long life without glory, or a short life filled with it. He declared that he had chosen the former. He would sail for home. Phoenix then spoke, his voice thick with emotion, reminding Achilles of their shared past, of the boy he had raised. He wept as he begged him to set aside his anger. Achilles was touched, but his resolve did not break. Finally, Ajax, frustrated by the futility of words, spoke plainly. He appealed to their friendship, to the duty a warrior has to his comrades. But Achilles' wound was too deep. He had been publicly dishonored, and he saw the entire system of heroic values as a sham. The embassy returned to the Greek camp under the cloak of night, their heads bowed in failure. The last, best hope of the Achaean army had been extinguished. Achilles had made his choice, leaving his friends to face the wrath of Troy alone. In his self-imposed exile, Achilles was not entirely alone. By his side remained the one person who understood the complex heart of the great warrior, Patroclus. Their bond was the central pillar of Achilles' life, a connection that ran deeper than comradeship or kinship. They had been raised together in the halls of Achilles' father, Peleus. Patroclus, the elder of the two, had arrived as an exile, and the young Achilles had welcomed him. From that day, they were inseparable. Patroclus was the steady hand to Achilles' fiery spirit, the voice of compassion that tempered his friend's superhuman rage. He was more than a companion. He was, in the words of the epic, the person Achilles honored most of all his comrades, honored as his own life. While Achilles nursed his wounded pride, Patroclus felt the suffering of the Achaeans with an aching heart. He would often walk through the camp, tending to the wounded, listening to their stories of loss. He saw the desperation in their eyes as the Trojan attacks intensified. The smoke from the burning Greek ships was a constant reminder of the disaster unfolding just beyond their tent. He could no longer bear to stand aside while their friends were being overwhelmed. The sight of the Greek cause collapsing under Hector's relentless assault finally broke his resolve. With tears in his eyes, he approached Achilles. He did not berate his friend or question his honor. Instead, he painted a vivid picture of the carnage, of noble heroes falling, of the entire expedition on the verge of being driven into the sea. He understood Achilles' oath not to fight until the fire reached his own ships, and he respected it. But he proposed a daring compromise. "If you will not fight," he pleaded, "then let me. Give me your armor, and let me lead your Myrmidons into battle. The Trojans will think you have returned. They will flee, and our comrades will have a chance to breathe." It was a desperate, brilliant, and terribly dangerous idea. To wear the armor of Achilles was to become a symbol, a beacon of hope for the Greeks, and a specter of terror for the Trojans. The request hung in the air between them, a fateful proposition born from love and a desire to save the people they had fought alongside for 9 long years. Achilles looked at his dearest friend, his heart torn between his rigid oath and his love for the man before him. His decision would not only alter the course of the war, but would also set in motion a tragedy from which there could be no return. Torn between his oath and his love for Patroclus, Achilles relented. He agreed to the plan, but with a grave and explicit warning. "Go," he said, "drive the Trojans from our ships, but once they are clear, you must return. Do not be tempted by glory. Do not press your attack to the walls of Troy, for the city is protected by the gods." The arming of Patroclus was a momentous occasion. The Myrmidons, Achilles' elite fighting force, poured from their tents, ecstatic to be rejoining the fray. They watched in awe as their commander was transformed. Patroclus donned the divine armor, crafted by the smith god Hephaestus. The gleaming greaves clicked into place, followed by the magnificent breastplate that shone like a star. Finally, the iconic helmet, with its intimidating horsehair crest, was placed on his head. In that moment, he was the very image of Achilles. The illusion was nearly perfect. Only Achilles' colossal spear, a weapon no other man could wield, was left behind. With a great war cry, Patroclus leaped onto a chariot and led the Myrmidons in a thunderous charge. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and overwhelming. The Trojans, who were on the verge of burning the last of the Greek ships, froze in terror. They saw the legendary armor, the fearsome Myrmidons, and believed their greatest nightmare had come true. Achilles had returned. Panic shattered their formations. They abandoned their attack and fled in a chaotic retreat. Patroclus was magnificent. He fought with a skill and fury that surprised even himself, cutting a path through the Trojan ranks. He successfully drove them from the ships, fulfilling the first part of his mission. But here, at the peak of his triumph, a fatal flaw emerged. The thrill of battle, the feeling of invincibility bestowed by the divine armor, and the roar of his adoring men intoxicated him. He forgot Achilles' solemn warning. Instead of turning back, he pressed his advantage, chasing the fleeing Trojans across the plain, his heart swelling with a warrior's pride. He pushed them all the way to the very walls of Troy. There, at the height of his glory, his fate turned. Apollo, the protector of Troy, decided the deception had gone on long enough. The god struck Patroclus from behind, stunning him and causing the divine armor to fall away. Exposed and disoriented, he was wounded by a lesser Trojan before facing the city's greatest champion, Hector. The hero who wore the armor of a legend was gone, leaving only a man to face his destiny. The news arrived like a physical blow, delivered by a messenger whose face was a mask of despair. Patroclus was gone, and Hector, in the ultimate act of desecration, had stripped him of Achilles' divine armor and now wore it as a trophy. The world of Achilles collapsed into a single point of absolute loss. The formidable warrior, the man who had defied a king over a point of honor, crumpled to the ground. He poured dust and ash over his head, his cries of anguish echoing across the shore, so profound that they reached his mother, Thetis, in her grotto beneath the waves. This was not the petulant anger he had shown Agamemnon. This was a primal scream of grief that stripped away his pride, his honor, and his very will to live. All the reasons for his withdrawal from the war, the insults, the principles, the stubborn pride, turned to ash. They were meaningless compared to the gaping void left by Patroclus. A new, terrifying resolve began to form in the crucible of his sorrow. He would re-enter the war not for glory, not for the Achaeans, but for one singular purpose: vengeance. He confessed to his mother that life held no more meaning for him unless he could personally end Hector's life. In that moment, he fully embraced the fate he had once tried to outrun. He would have his revenge, and he would find his own end on the Trojan plain. His transformation was chilling. The fire of his earlier rage was replaced by a cold, dark resolve. He publicly reconciled with Agamemnon, not out of forgiveness, but out of a pragmatic need to rejoin the fight. When the king returned Briseis and presented the vast treasures he had promised, Achilles barely acknowledged them. Material wealth and public apologies were now worthless. All he required was the means to fight. His own legendary armor was gone, now worn by the man he had sworn to destroy. As his mother Thetis departed, promising to obtain a new set of divine armor from the god Hephaestus, a somber quiet fell over the Greek camp. The return of their greatest champion brought no celebration. They were not getting back the hero who fought for their cause. They were unleashing a force of nature, a man remade by loss into an instrument of pure retribution, who would carve a path to his enemy through anyone who stood in his way, regardless of the ultimate cost. The war for Troy had been a decade-long symphony of clashing bronze and cries of valor, but the sound that now tore through the Achaean camp was of a different nature entirely. It was the sound of a world breaking. When the news of Patroclus's fall reached Achilles, it was not delivered in a quiet whisper, but as a thunderclap that shattered his soul. The hero, who had seemed more divine than mortal, collapsed. He poured dust and ash over his golden hair, defiling the beauty that marked him as a child of a goddess. His cry was not merely human. It was a primal roar of anguish that traveled across the water, pierced the depths of the Aegean Sea, and reached his mother, Thetis, in her coral grotto. She heard the sorrow of her son, a pain she had always known would one day come. The Myrmidons, his loyal soldiers, followed their leader's example, their collective mourning a testament to the love they held for the fallen Patroclus. In this moment, Achilles was stripped of his divinity, his invulnerability, his pride. He was a man confronting the most profound loss imaginable. The political machinations that had driven him from the field seemed utterly insignificant now. Agamemnon, hearing of his despair, quickly sent emissaries to offer a formal apology. He promised the return of Briseis, untouched, along with a treasure trove of tripods, gold, and horses, everything a king could desire. But Achilles was beyond desiring such things. The wound was not to his honor, but to his heart. The treasures of the world could not fill the void left by his companion. He rejected the offer without a second thought. His rage, once a simmering fire directed at his own commander, now had a new, singular target: Hector of Troy, the man who wore Patroclus's armor as a trophy. As Thetis rose from the waves to comfort her son, she saw a terrifying resolve harden in his eyes. He would fight again. Not for Agamemnon, not for Helen, not even for the glory that was his destiny. He would return to the war for one purpose: vengeance. He would hunt Hector to the ends of the earth. But he was without his armor, the divine protection that had been his birthright. Thetis knew what she must do. She would ascend to Olympus and petition a god to forge a new set, an armor worthy of the fury that was about to be unleashed upon Troy. While Achilles mourned on the shores of Troy, his divine mother, Thetis, ascended to the heavens, her purpose firm. She sought the celestial forge of Hephaestus, the master craftsman of the gods. His workshop, located on the peak of Mount Olympus, was a place of cosmic creation, where stars were born and lightning bolts were hammered into shape. Hephaestus, the lame god, owed Thetis a great debt, for she had sheltered him long ago when he was cast out of Olympus. He greeted her warmly and listened to her plea for armor for her mortal son. Without hesitation, he agreed, promising a creation that would astound both mortals and gods. Hephaestus set to work at his anvil. With his powerful arms, he shaped bronze, tin, silver, and gold. The centerpiece of his work was the shield, a masterpiece that transcended its function as a tool of war. It was a perfect circle, a microcosm of the entire human experience. Upon its surface, Hephaestus depicted the universe, the earth, the sun, the moon, and the constellations. He crafted two cities. One was a city at peace, filled with weddings, festivals, and orderly justice. The other was a city at war, besieged by armies, its people locked in a desperate struggle for survival. He forged scenes of rural life, fields being plowed, vineyards heavy with grapes, and shepherds guarding their flocks. He showed young men and women dancing at a harvest festival, their joy a stark contrast to the grim reality of the Trojan plain. The shield was a mirror reflecting all that humanity builds and all that war destroys. It was a profound statement on the value of the life Achilles was preparing to both defend and extinguish. When the armor was complete, it shone with a divine light. Thetis descended like a falcon, carrying the celestial panoply to her son. As she laid it before him on the sand, the Myrmidons shielded their eyes, unable to bear its brilliance. But Achilles looked upon it without flinching. He lifted the great shield, feeling its weight and its power. The intricate scenes of life and peace did not deter him. They fueled his resolve. This was the world Patroclus had been denied. As he donned the greaves, the breastplate, and the magnificent helmet, his transformation was complete. The grieving man vanished, replaced by a radiant, terrifying figure, an instrument of divine retribution, ready to inscribe his own brutal chapter onto the history of the world. The return of Achilles to the battlefield was not a reinforcement. It was an apocalypse. Clad in his new, God-forged armor, he blazed like a destructive star. The Trojans, who had been pressing their advantage to the very ships of the Achaeans, now broke and fled in terror. His war cry alone was enough to cause panic. This was not the calculated warfare of strategy and formation. This was a force of nature unleashed. Achilles drove his chariot, pulled by the immortal horses Xanthos and Peleus, directly into the heart of the Trojan lines. He was unstoppable, a whirlwind of bronze and fury, seeking only one face in the chaos: Hector. His rage was so immense that he battled not only men, but the landscape itself. He pursued so many Trojans into the river Scamander that its waters became clogged, and the river god rose in anger to challenge him. Yet even a deity could not halt Achilles' advance. The gods on Olympus watched, divided. Some favored the Achaeans, others Troy, but all were awed by the spectacle of Achilles' power. As the Trojan army scrambled for the safety of their city walls, their commander, Hector, made a fateful decision. He sent his men inside, but remained outside the Scaean gate, standing alone. His aged parents, King Priam and Queen Hecuba, cried out to him from the ramparts, begging him to come inside, to not face the unstoppable son of Peleus. But Hector was bound by his honor. He had led his army to this point, and he felt the weight of responsibility for the losses they had sustained. To retreat now would be to live with shame forever. He would face his destiny. Achilles spotted him from across the plain and charged. For a single, human moment, Hector's courage failed him. He turned and ran. What followed was a grim spectacle. The greatest warrior of the Achaeans pursued the greatest warrior of the Trojans around the mighty walls of Troy. 3 times they circled the city, a desperate chase witnessed by gods and men. Finally, the goddess Athena, siding with the Achaeans, appeared to Hector in the guise of his brother, tricking him into stopping to make a stand. The chase was over. The two heroes, the pillars of their respective armies, finally stood face to face. The fate of Troy, the future of the war, would be decided here, in the dust before the Scaean gate. The duel between Achilles and Hector was swift and decisive. The champion of Troy fell, and with him, the city's last great hope. But for Achilles, this victory brought no peace. His grief for Patroclus remained a raw, open wound, and his rage demanded more. In an act that shocked both armies and displeased the gods, Achilles refused to grant Hector the honors due to a noble adversary. Overcome by his passion, he committed a profound desecration. He fastened Hector's body to the back of his chariot and dragged his fallen foe through the dust, circling the very walls his rival had died defending. From the ramparts, Hector's family watched in horror, their cries of anguish unheard by the vengeful warrior. For 12 days, Achilles' fury did not abate. Each morning, he would drag the body around the tomb of Patroclus, his actions a dark ritual of sorrow and retribution. But this violation of sacred custom could not stand. The gods, who had once admired his prowess, were now appalled by his cruelty. Zeus, the king of the gods, intervened. He sent a message to Achilles through his mother, Thetis. He must cease his outrage and allow the Trojans to ransom Hector's body. At the same time, the gods gave King Priam the courage for an impossible mission. Guided by the god Hermes, the old king of Troy loaded a cart with priceless treasures and traveled by night, alone, through enemy lines and into the heart of the Achaean camp. He entered the lodge of Achilles, the man who had brought ruin to his family, and knelt before him. He kissed the hands of the warrior and made his plea, not as a king to a conqueror, but as one grieving father to another. He asked Achilles to think of his own father, Peleus, and to show mercy. In that moment, something shifted within Achilles. Priam's words pierced through his armor of rage and touched the shared humanity beneath. He saw not the enemy of his people, but an old man shattered by loss, just as he was. He wept, not only for Patroclus, but for his own father, who would soon mourn him, and for the tragic cycle of the war. His humanity, so long suppressed by anger, finally resurfaced. Achilles accepted the ransom, personally helping Priam place Hector's body on the cart. A truce was declared for 11 days, so that Troy could properly mourn its hero. This act of compassion was his finest moment, yet it was also a prelude to his own end, for his fate was inextricably tied to Hector's. With the truce for Hector's funeral concluded, the war resumed its relentless course. Achilles, having found a moment of profound humanity, returned to the fray with the cold certainty of a man who knows his time is short. He fought with a terrifying clarity, no longer driven by wild rage, but by the quiet acceptance of his own destiny. He was the Achaeans' bulwark, their undeniable champion, and every Trojan who faced him knew they were facing a living legend. He seemed more than mortal, a figure immune to the common fates of men. The Trojans fell back before him, their morale broken. It seemed that as long as Achilles drew breath, the walls of Troy could not stand. But prophecy is not a suggestion. It is an unalterable truth. His mother had foretold that he would have a choice, a long, quiet life without fame, or a short, glorious one ending at Troy. He had made his choice long ago. His end came not in a heroic duel with a worthy opponent, but from the shadows, a stroke of fortune guided by divine will. The battle raged near the Scaean Gate, the very place where he had achieved his greatest triumph over Hector. Paris, the Trojan prince whose actions had begun the war, was not a warrior of Hector's caliber. He preferred the bow to the sword, a weapon often considered less honorable in an age of close combat. He drew his bow, perhaps aiming for the great warrior, perhaps simply firing into the chaos. But his arrow did not fly on chance alone. The god Apollo, the divine protector of Troy, saw his opportunity to remove the Achaeans' greatest asset. He guided the arrow's path, steering it away from the divine armor, and towards the one small part of Achilles that remained mortal. The arrow struck Achilles in the heel, the single spot where his mother's hand had held him as she dipped him into the waters of the river Styx, shielding it from its magical properties. The wound was small, but it was enough. The great Achilles, the seemingly invincible demigod, stumbled and fell. A gasp ran through both armies. The Achaeans fought with desperate fury to retrieve his body, refusing to let it suffer the same fate as Patroclus. His fall marked the end of an era. The age of singular, superhuman heroes was over. Yet, in falling, Achilles secured the immortal glory he had always craved. His name would not be forgotten. It would become a story, a legend, an echo that reverberates through millennia, a timeless testament to the warrior's choice, the conflict between fate and will, and the inescapable truth that even the strongest among us is defined, ultimately, by their humanity.